June 4th, 1942. 10:22 a.m. High above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peers down through broken clouds at a sight that makes his heart race. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, their decks crowded with planes, fuel lines snaking across the flight decks, ordnance crews frantically preparing for launch. McCluskey keys his radio. Attack immediately. What happens in the next 6 minutes will change the course of World War II. By 10:28 a.m., 3 of those carriers will be burning wrecks, doomed to sink beneath the waves. The Japanese Navy, which seemed unstoppable just hours before, will have lost the initiative in the Pacific War forever. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, a story of code breakers in courage, of sacrifice and split-second timing, of how a few dozen American dive bomber pilots turned the tide of history in less time than it takes to soft-boil an egg. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. We cover the most dramatic moments in military history, and trust me, they don't get more dramatic than this. To understand why those 6 minutes mattered so much, we need to go back 6 months. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack had been devastating. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning, and that was just the beginning. In the months that followed, Japan seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day 1941. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February, the worst defeat in British military history. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, all conquered in a matter of weeks. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. But there was a problem. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knew something his more optimistic colleagues didn't want to admit. Japan couldn't win a long war against America. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, understood American industrial capacity. He knew that given time, the sleeping giant would awaken with terrible fury. Yamamoto's strategy was simple but brutal. Expand rapidly, establish a defensive perimeter, and make the cost of reconquest so high that America would negotiate peace. But for this to work, Japan needed to destroy America's aircraft carriers, the 3 flat tops that had been at sea during Pearl Harbor and had escaped destruction. The target he chose was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It wasn't strategically vital in itself, but Yamamoto knew the Americans couldn't ignore a threat to their last outpost defending the Hawaiian Islands. The U.S. carriers would have to come out and fight. And when they did, Japan's superior carrier force would annihilate them. On paper, it was a brilliant plan. Japan would deploy 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These weren't just any carriers. They were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. They carried over 250 aircraft flown by veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. These pilots had perfected their craft over China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean. They were, quite simply, the finest carrier aviators in the world.
Against this juggernaut, America could muster 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown shouldn't have even been there. She had been badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just a month earlier and should have needed months of repairs. Navy Yard workers at Pearl Harbor accomplished a miracle, patching her up in just 72 hours. She was held together by cables, welded patches, and American determination, but she could fight. Maybe. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing enemy pilots with far more experience. But they had one advantage, an advantage so important that it would prove decisive. They knew the Japanese were coming. In a basement office at Pearl Harbor, a team of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts had been working around the clock for months. Their target? JN-25, the Japanese Navy's main operational code. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the effort. Brilliant, eccentric, often working in a bathrobe because he refused to waste time on military formality, Rochefort and his team had gradually pieced together fragments of intercepted Japanese messages. By late May 1942, they knew something big was coming. The Japanese were planning a major operation. The target was identified in messages as AF. But where was AF? Rochefort was convinced it was Midway. Others in naval intelligence thought it might be the Aleutian Islands, or even the West Coast. The debate raged through the command structure. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed certainty. If he positioned his carriers at Midway and the Japanese struck somewhere else, Hawaii could be lost. Rochefort came up with an ingenious plan. He had Midway send a radio message, in the clear, unencrypted, reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Sure enough, within days, Japanese intelligence transmitted an encoded message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. Gotcha. Now Nimitz knew where and approximately when the Japanese would strike. It was still a desperate gamble. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese, but at least it wouldn't be a surprise. The Americans could set a trap. Admiral Nimitz gave his carrier commanders their orders. Proceed to a position northeast of Midway, wait for the Japanese to commit to their attack on the island, then strike their carriers while their decks were crowded with aircraft, rearming and refueling. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was the only chance they had. June 4, 1942 began with a Japanese strike on Midway Island itself. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, launched 108 aircraft toward Midway. Half his strike force. The plan was to soften up the island's defenses before the invasion force arrived. Nagumo held back his second wave, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack any American ships that might appear. The American carriers, positioned roughly 200 miles northeast of Midway, waited in silence. Radio intercepts and scout planes confirmed the Japanese position. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet, made a gutsy decision. Instead of waiting for the Japanese to return from Midway, he would launch immediately. His planes would catch the Japanese carriers while they were recovering the Midway strike force, their decks crowded with landing aircraft, their combat air patrol depleted, their guard down.
It was risky. Launching at extreme range meant his aircraft might not have enough fuel to return, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. At 7 a.m., the American carriers began launching everything they had. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, 157 aircraft in total. They formed up and headed southwest toward the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, Nagumo was facing a dilemma. The strike on Midway had done damage, but the mission commander radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." At the same time, his scout planes hadn't spotted any American ships. Nagumo made a decision that would haunt him. He ordered the reserve strike force below decks. The torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were removed, replaced with high-explosive bombs for a second strike on Midway. It was 7:15 a.m. Ordnance crews sweated in the tropical heat, moving weapons, rearming aircraft. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A scout plane radioed, "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships." Nagumo's blood ran cold. "American ships, here!" He demanded clarification. "Ascertain ship types." Minutes crawled by. The Midway strike force was approaching, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. The flight decks had to be cleared. But if there was an American carrier out there? At 7:45 a.m., the scout plane sent the message Nagumo dreaded: enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Now Nagumo faced an impossible choice. His decks were cluttered with aircraft armed for land attack. To attack the American carrier, he needed to rearm everything again with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. But his Midway strike force was running out of fuel, circling overhead. If he didn't recover them immediately, they'd crash into the sea. Nagumo chose to recover his aircraft first, then rearm for a carrier strike. It seemed reasonable. After all, the Americans were still 200 miles away. There was time. Or so he thought. The first American aircraft to find the Japanese fleet were 15 torpedo bombers from the Hornet. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. These men flew the Douglas TBD Devastator, and the name was tragically ironic. The Devastator was hopelessly obsolete by 1942. Slow, lightly armed, and forced to fly low and straight during their attack runs, they were sitting ducks for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Waldron Squadron approached at 9:20 a.m. 4 Japanese carriers were visible on the horizon, destroyers and cruisers surrounding them in a protective screen, and above the fleet, waiting like hawks, dozens of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. Waldron knew what was about to happen. Before takeoff, he'd told his men, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." The Devastators began their attack run, skimming just above the waves at 115 miles per hour. They needed to get within 1,000 yards to drop their torpedoes, a lifetime when fighters are diving on you and every ship in the fleet is firing. The Zeros tore into them like wolves among sheep. Devastators exploded, cartwheeled into the sea, broke apart in mid-air. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, which had been at high altitude, dove to wave-top level to slaughter the torpedo bombers. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. All 15 of Torpedo Squadron 8's aircraft was shot down. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who would spend the next 30 hours floating in his life raft, watching the battle unfold. 14 men dead, not a single torpedo hit. But they weren't alone. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived next, then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. Wave after wave of Devastators pressed home their attacks, flying into a wall of fire. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers. It seemed like a complete disaster. The American torpedo attack had failed utterly. The Japanese fleet remained untouched. Japanese sailors and pilots began to feel invincible. They'd destroyed nearly 3 squadrons of American aircraft without suffering a single hit. But those dying torpedo bomber crews had accomplished something crucial, even if they'd never know it. They'd dragged the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level. At 10:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was lost and running out of fuel. McCluskey commanded Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft. They'd been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, following the projected intercept course. But the Japanese had changed course after launching their midway strike, and McCluskey had found only empty ocean. His fuel gauge showed critical levels. Every pilot in his squadron was thinking the same thing. Do we turn back now, or keep searching and ditch in the ocean? McCluskey made a command decision. He'd search for just 15 more minutes, following a new heading based on pure intuition and experience. At 10:22 a.m., through a gap in the clouds, he saw it, a lone Japanese destroyer, racing northeast at full speed. McCluskey knew instantly what it meant. That destroyer was trying to catch up with the main fleet. He followed its wake, and there they were, 4 Japanese air carriers arrayed in a box formation about 2 miles apart. Their decks were packed with aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Fuel lines ran everywhere. Ordnance crews were still rearming aircraft, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck. It was the perfect moment. The Japanese were completely vulnerable. Better yet, at almost the same instant, dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived from a different direction. By pure chance, 2 American dive bomber squadrons had found the same target at the same moment. And because the torpedo bombers had pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, McCluskey and Leslie were at 14,000 feet, completely unmolested. McCluskey divided his forces. He'd take Akagi and Kaga, the 2 largest carriers. Leslie would hit Soryu. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey rolled into his dive and began the attack that would change history. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was the opposite of the Devastator. It was perhaps the best dive bomber of World War II. In a dive, it could reach speeds of over 250 miles per hour, and its perforated dive flaps kept it stable even in a near-vertical plunge. The Japanese called them hell divers, and for good reason. McCluskey's first wave dove on Kaga. The Japanese carrier was turning hard, trying to evade, but at 14,000 feet there was plenty of time to adjust. The first bomb was a near miss. The second hit squarely amidships, then another, and another. In moments, 4 1,000-pound bombs had struck Kaga's flight deck. The effect was catastrophic. Kaga's deck was packed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Aviation fuel sprayed everywhere. Bombs detonated. Torpedoes exploded. Within seconds, the entire carrier was a raging inferno. Fire spread to the hangar deck below, where more armed and fueled aircraft were waiting. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Men were burned alive, blown overboard, trapped below decks as fire consumed everything. Meanwhile, other dive bombers targeted Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Akagi was more fortunate at first. Most bombs missed. But at 10:26 a.m., one 1,000-pound bomb struck directly behind the carrier's midship elevator. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck below, right among armed and fueled aircraft preparing for launch. The explosion blew the aircraft elevator completely out of its mounts, throwing it into the air. Fire engulfed the hangar deck, then spread rapidly forward and aft. Within minutes, Akagi was doomed. And Soryu? Yorktown's dive bombers hit her with 3 bombs in rapid succession. All 3 penetrated to the hangar deck. Like her sister ships, Soryu's ready aircraft detonated, starting uncontrollable fires. She would sink in just 20 minutes, the first of the 3 to go down. By 10:28 a.m., just 6 minutes after the attack began, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their crews abandoning ship, their battle flags consumed by fire. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock, his face blank. One of his staff officers had to physically grab him and insist they transfer to a different ship. Akagi was dying, and the admiral had to survive to command the remaining forces. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were being abandoned to the flames. The battle wasn't over. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, had been farther north and escaped the dive bomber attack. She immediately launched a counterstrike against Yorktown, crippling the American carrier with bomb and torpedo hits. But American scout planes found Hiryu that afternoon, and dive bombers from Enterprise sent her to the bottom by evening. By sunset on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk or sinking. Japan had lost 248 aircraft and, more importantly, many of its most experienced carrier pilots, men who could not be replaced. The Americans had lost Yorktown and about 150 aircraft, but Enterprise and Hornet remained operational. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan had suffered its first major defeat of the war. But the significance went far beyond one battle. Japan's carrier construction program could not replace 4 fleet carriers quickly. Even more critically, Japan's pilot training program had been designed for quality over quantity. It took years to produce the kind of expert aviators who'd fought since 1937 in China. Those men, now dead at the bottom of the Pacific, were essentially irreplaceable. From June 4, 1942 onward, Japan would be on the defensive in the Pacific. The tide had turned.
And it had turned in 6 minutes. Those 6 minutes were the product of courage, sacrifice, intelligence work, and remarkable timing. The codebreakers who gave Nimitz the information he needed. The torpedo bomber crews who died drawing Japanese fighters away from altitude. McCluskey's decision to keep searching when he should have turned back. The pure chance that brought 2 dive bomber squadrons over the Japanese fleet at the same moment. History often turns on moments like these, moments where everything comes together, where courage meets opportunity, where the improbable becomes reality. June 4, 1942, 10:22 to 10:28 a.m. was one of those moments. 6 minutes that changed the world.